Hello and welcome to Mission in Focus. In this webinar, I'm joined by Xavier Simons from the Institute for Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame to discuss 4 key principles of Catholic social teaching and how they can be applied as we work in Catholic health and aged care, particularly in decision making. Xavier, what does Catholic social teaching have to offer for people working in Catholic health and aged care when they have decisions to make?
Catholic social teaching is based on 4 principles. The 4 principles are human dignity, common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. Let's start with human dignity, which is perhaps a principle which is maybe more accessible than some of the other principles in the vast array of Catholic social thought. Human dignity, more or less, is the idea that each human being has a worth that's not is unquantifiable, if you will, or inestimable, that we can't reduce to some dollar figure, that we can't reduce to a certain limit in terms of what we provide for that person, the kind of care that we're willing to provide to that person, but rather that that person has an inestimable worth, that their life has an inalienable value. And in that sense, the principle of human dignity leads us to treat all human beings with the utmost respect, the utmost concern for their well-being, and also to seek to help them to not only survive in the world, but also to flourish as human beings, spiritually, materially, socially, psychologically, and so forth. So the principle of human dignity is particularly important, I think, when understanding the kind of care that one should be looking to provide in their professional life in a Catholic institution. That can guide us as well in terms of the sorts of decisions that we make at a managerial level. If you're looking after policy decisions for a hospital or a series of hospitals or a series of aged care facilities, it's always very important to bear in mind that behind those dollar figures, behind those abstract terms are human beings who are particularly vulnerable, are often sick, disabled, or what have you, coming towards the end of life and require special care. The principle of human dignity should guide decision making in those contexts. The idea of the common good has a pedigree which goes beyond the Christian tradition. This is sometimes an important point to make because people often think that Catholic ethics exists in a vacuum, that it's just thought up by a group of old bishops or something like that. But quite on the contrary, Catholic ethics draws upon insights from the ancient Greek tradition, from Eastern traditions, from modern ethics even. And in that sense, the idea of the common good is a principle that shouldn't be unfamiliar and is by no means inaccessible to people not working within the Catholic tradition. So the idea of the common good is that we shouldn't focus on meeting the needs of only a few or the many, but rather the needs of all. And that to achieve the good for anyone, we need to look at achieving the good for everyone. I think there's an important difference between the common good and a utilitarian ethic. More or less, a utilitarian ethic is based on the principle that we should aim to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That contrasts with the common good in the following way. A utilitarian ethic would permit us to aim to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people at the expense of the good of the few, or of the very few, or even of one person. That would be permissible on a utilitarian ethic, to focus on maximising the provision of healthcare for the many while neglecting to provide healthcare for the few or the one. That's in direct contrast with the notion of the common good, which is that we need to provide care for all human beings. That can be care in terms of social services, care in terms of healthcare, care in terms of allowing people to participate in political life and public life. But nevertheless, it's a universalist ethic as opposed to an ethic like utilitarianism, which tolerates the tyranny of the majority. And that's a very problematic ethical framework, particularly when you're trying to work in an environment where you're tempted to make decisions that are rational, that have an economic rationalism underpinning them. I think one of the important insights that the common good can lead Catholic healthcare providers to make is that when we're trying to think about, for example, rationing of healthcare resources or making financial decisions about the future of a hospital or an aged care facility, it's true, you can't ignore the financial aspect of things. You need to, or the fact that there are limited resources available. We can't ignore those things, whatever level we're at, be it at the coalface, at a clinical level, or at a managerial level. Nevertheless, we should always try and balance that with the awareness that we have a duty to care for all people, and we shouldn't make arbitrary distinctions between people, because in the end that doesn't actually take into account the principle of human dignity, that there's an inalienable worth that all human beings have, and that's not taken away or lost due to the fact that someone gets sick, that someone is coming towards the end of life. Then there are two other principles to Catholic social teaching that I think are particularly important to discuss. As I mentioned, the principle of solidarity is one of the primary principles in the framework. Solidarity is the idea that we're not islands, if you will. No man is an island, no woman is an island, that we're all in it together in life and in the game of human flourishing. And what that means in practice is that we can't act as isolated units or see ourselves as isolated units in any situation. We need to seek to provide care for, to include other people in decision making, in our ethical concern, rather than seeing, for example, myself as the only important person in my ethical reasoning. I think is a really important insight. So just to sort of recap on that idea of solidarity, when providing any sort of service which comes under the banner of Catholic, individuals need to remember that we have a responsibility to care for all other people, not just those closest to us, not just those we've decided are deserving of care, but rather all of humanity, all of the human family, or the human moral community. And that's really important because there'll often be situations where we don't feel that we have a duty to other people. We don't feel that we have a duty to provide further treatment for the drug addict. We don't feel that we have a duty to allow the criminal to receive care in the hospital. But there's a sense in which the principle of solidarity leads us to think differently about those sorts of situations, to be aware of the fact that we're in a sense part of a human community, and that generates bonds of companionship, if you will, or bonds of humanity that should lead us to act in particular ways to show a certain regard for all other human beings. So it's a really, really important idea, I think, to have in the forefront of our sort of ethical minds when we're approaching Catholic healthcare ethics. Finally, the idea of subsidiarity. It's perhaps the most complex of principles in the framework. More or less subsidiarity, however, to put it very simply, refers to allowing people closest to the situation to make the decisions about that situation, or at least giving them some sort of a say in the decision making, with the awareness that they'll often make the best decisions or have the best insights or have very valuable insights in that sort of situation because they're the ones who are involved in it. So there's several ways in which that can play out in practice, in ethical practice in a Catholic institution. One can immediately think of, for example, the typical decision-making structure or hierarchy in a hospital where it's often tempting for management to come in over the top and make some sort of like blanket decision about a controversial issue where it may be the case that it would be quite valuable to consult sort of junior staff, more junior staff, and see what they have to say about the particular issue. Try and understand why they're suggesting a particular response, a particular approach to that issue, rather than just dismissing it as sort of a lack of professional experience. It's sort of a sense in which that because of their lack of familiarity with the broader structure of the organisation, functioning of the organisation, they just don't know what they're talking about. That's a really, really important consideration to integrate into one's professional life, I think, in Catholic institutions. In addition to that, there's also a sense in which you need to think about the patient, and you need to think about the resident in the aged care facility and decision making involving them. There's often a sense that we as the professional can come in and say, okay, well, I know what's right. I know what the right thing to do in this particular situation is, what's good for you. But that can often overlook the fact that this particular patient is in a very specific situation. They've got a background, they've got a cultural background, they have a personality. They know more about their situation often than you do, and you really need to listen to that and be very willing to change your mind on issues in that sense, to be sensitive, I suppose, to the interests and insights of those who are closest to the issue.
For more Mission in Focus episodes, visit the Catholic Health Australia website and follow the links on our homepage. I'm Margaret Deeren. Thanks for being part of the conversation.